As a result, I'm going to toss it back over to John Jablonski, who's going to introduce Ken Field. Thanks.
And thanks, Courtney, and thanks to everybody who's participated so far, and all the people who are attending. Well, I don't know if your office chairs or your couches have seatbelts, but you might want to strap yourselves in. Matt Toro is a pretty energetic speaker. Ken, you may have heard his voice earlier, is a Brit. And doesn't talk quite as fast as Matt, but he brings the same kind of enthusiasm. I think, Ken, have you been with Esri for 10 years at this point?
Yeah, nearly. It's
Yeah, nearly.
10 years next March.
So, we've already heard from a number of people who work in libraries. Ken Field is I don't know if his official title is Carto Nerd, but that's what his official Esri biography calls him. He is a cartographer for Esri, for ESRI, essentially the Microsoft of computer cartography at this point, and really for the past 30 years. It's the one major large commercial company that's in this professional scientific and thematic mapping space. You think about the things that are amazing on Google Earth. Esri does probably 20 other things that are equally impactful and really interesting. Ken brings a great sense of humor to his work, and like I said, a real enthusiasm. And he's telling me to, it's the enthusiasm piece. But
No,
whenever I do go to the annual Esri meetings, I make sure to attend Ken's presentations on the technologies of cartography, and that he really pushes Esri's products to the limits. I bet the engineers just like cringe when they see him coming. Like, what does he want us to build now? With that, I'm just going to give the rest of the time over to Ken, and he will walk you through a really interesting example of contemporary cartography about the Grand Canyon.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, John. And it's wonderful to be doing this. I mean, I've done a lot of this recently. Like sitting on my backside, presenting to various organisations across the globe, and it's fantastic. I just want to pick up actually with a comment from the conversation you just had about map societies, and just to add there that I'm heavily involved with a lot of British cartographic societies, and they're going through exactly the same discussions and having the same issues and talking about membership and what they can offer and so on and so forth. So I think this is more of an international trend than purely a North American trend. And I'd also, if you don't already know, encourage you to recall that the North American Cartographic Information Society, NACIS, is holding their annual conference virtually at the end of this coming week, which is going to be a 3-day Carto Fest. So that should be pretty cool. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, and let's see how we go with this. Somebody could. Sorry.
Yep, okay. We see your PowerPoint.
And cool. So you've got the slides and not the presenter view, right?
Yep.
Good. Excellent. Otherwise, I could switch it and you could just read this, and that would be probably better without the jokes, right? So I gave this talk at the Grand Canyon conference some sort of year and a half ago that Matt organised, and it's more of a talk about a personal journey, and a journey physically with how I've had a relationship with Grand Canyon and over the years, and also a journey cartographically. What is it that I've done with the data, with the mapping of the Grand Canyon? So that's the context, and this is the map. This is the map that I've made of Grand Canyon, and it was made in 2012. I first made this map, and I made it of all the known depths in Grand Canyon. So I apologize. It's a fairly morbid topic, but I actually find that quite a lot of my maps tend to look at aspects of death. I've done a lot of disease mapping, I've remade Minard's famous Napoleon's March map, which is, of course, is about decimation of troops. And it suddenly struck me a few years ago that actually, you know, this seems to be a topic that I gravitate to for I don't know what reason whatsoever. But in this talk, I'll tell you a little bit of why I gravitated towards this particular topic. And actually, this map is two maps. It's a print map and a web map. So I'm going to cover a little bit of both of these and why the two are complementary. They both require very different approaches to deliver the material, to deliver the thematic data effectively, perhaps to different audiences. So it's going to be a talk about the design of the map, or the maps. It's going to be inspired by a story. But first, I guess, how did I ever get to the point of being fascinated with such a macabre subjects, and what's a Brit doing, you know, mapping one of the world's greatest physical features anyway? I mean, you know, British Isles has got some wonderful scenery, but looking at Ordnance Survey maps as a child, you would never ever see anything that would look anything similar to the topography of the Grand Canyon. So, like most kids, I guess most people can pinpoint a moment perhaps in history where things began to fall into place for them. And my father was an academic geologist. His subject specialism was southern Norway, actually, and we spent a lot of time out there. And our home in England was often filled with, you know, really abstract geological maps of who knows where. You know, I was just looking at these maps with colours all over them, crazy symbology, and thinking, well, where are these places? And I pored over them, imagining sort of long lost places being represented by a myriad of colour and symbology. And we also had a subscription to National Geographic. And I always loved it when, you know, the magazine would come through the front door letterbox and it dropped on the floor and there was a little bit of red text on it. And that red text meant there was a fold out map that was going to drop out. And that was the thing for me that was the most interesting part of National Geographic. And I recall one map in particular, we've already mentioned it a little bit, or Matt did earlier, in the July 1978 issue. And the spine simply read Grand Canyon. And of course, the map fell out. And perhaps more than any other map, this is the one that led me into a career in geography, a career eventually into cartography, even though I didn't really know what it was as a 9-year-old boy at this point of time. I didn't even know who Bradford and Barbara Washburn were, or even Tibor Toth, who brought their work to light in this masterpiece of cartographic work. And I didn't even know it was a masterpiece, right? It was just a beautiful piece of art. It was a beautiful map. And I was kind of spellbound by the place and thought, is there really somewhere on this planet that looks like that? You know, what's this map showing me? The colors, the shades, the textures, it felt more like a painting. And of course it was, it's largely airbrushed. But was it a painting, or was it a really accurate or extremely accurate map? What was its purpose? What was its role? And as a boy, you know, I was like, well, I've got to go there. I have to see this place because I have to ground truth it. I have to see if the map is actually telling me what it is that I'm supposed to be seeing. And on some level, as I said, I also knew that becoming a sort of a geographer, making maps like this, was something that I wanted to do. Well, you know, a 9-year-old boy can't summon the means to fly immediately and go and have a look at the place. So I had to wait another 25 years before I finally got an opportunity to visit. And that was the summer of 2003. And that's my blue tent up there. And my partner, Linda Beale, and I were on a month-long road trip. You know, we started off in San Fran, and we, funnily enough, the rental car place gave us a red Pontiac, which is, you know, why if you're going to do a road trip, why not go in a sports car? So we did that with our tent across this particular journey, and we camped along the way, and we spent a few nights at Mather Campground on the South Rim, accompanied by coyotes and electric storms and all sorts of weird, crazy stuff. And it turns out that actually Grand Canyon did look like that National Geographic map. Spectacular, you know, both of them, and the rich detail in the map did actually capture the drama and the majesty of the canyon and all the various layering of the rocks and things. And it was just spectacular. And I also got to go again about a year and a half ago with my brother and his family. They came over to the US, and we went on another little road trip, and that's them in the bottom left corner there. So we're able to keep going back to these places, and they're wonderful natural features, but they're also wonderful cartographic features. But of course, when you enter the park, you don't get given the National Geographic map. That's actually not much use for tourist purposes. I was handed this map at the park's gate in 2003, and again, it's wonderful. It's a totally different map, and I didn't know at the time who had made it, or even that I would strike up a really good friendship with its author, Tom Patterson of, well, now retired, but of National Park Service, maybe 10 or so years later. And just to go into a slight tangent here, a little story. We were also struck, when we visited in 2003, not just by the majesty of the environment, but also the inherent danger. And I recall being on the South Rim bus, which takes you along a little place between overlooks and that. And we stopped at the Bright Angel trailhead. And a lady wearing nothing more than a pink bikini top, a skirt, a pair of flip-flops on her feet, and clutching a really small bottle of water, got off the bus, and the amiable driver asked what she planned to do. She said she was going to head down the trail into the canyon, and then she was going to get a mule ride back up. And the bus fell silent, and the driver politely suggested that would be a pretty dumb idea, and she would likely not survive, which is a crazy thing, in a tourist site, to think that you might go on a little walk, but you might not survive. She was just in no way prepared for the task ahead, and she didn't start the trail, thankfully. But as night fell on the first of our few nights in the campground, there were two nervous British people in a tent with coyotes howling and electrical storms overhead that really didn't want to go out in the pitch black of night with a large drop and deadly wild animals for company. So we were getting a fair idea that this isn't the Lake District, right? This isn't nice, cozy, rolling countryside in Britain. This is a serious place. And something had struck us earlier in the day about this, that we were pretty much out of reading material by now. So we'd gone into the bookshop at the South Rim Tourist Centre, and one particular book I was very much drawn to. And remember, I had this image of the lady trying to go into the canyon on the Bright Angel Trail, and I still had the driver's comments ringing around my head. And the book that I was attracted to was called Over the Edge, Death in Grand Canyon by Michael Giglieri and Thomas Myers. And it was a 2001 book, so it was pretty up to date. We were visiting in 2003. And it was perhaps a little gory. It was certainly macabre. It was filled with amazing human stories, though. And I was intrigued to discover that there are probably no two deaths that are the same throughout history. And Linda and I in the tent just, used to take turns just reading little commentaries about some of these deaths, these tragedies, some of which were horribly tragic, and some of which bizarrely had a little comedy attached to them, which you start to reflect upon, and you think, well, really, is this something that we should be looking at in that way? But of course, I was struck by also the mapping in the book, as in there were hardly any maps, and my innate desire to not just understand, why or how these people met their deaths in the canyon, but where, where are the hot spots? Where are the really dangerous places? Do people tend to perhaps commit suicide in the same places? Do people tend to have accidents in the same places? Do people drown in the same places? And so, as a geographer, I had a natural curiosity to discover if there were any patterns to the incidents and where the areas of greatest risk. And of course, you can go on from that. If you know where the greatest risk is, you can actually prepare products that might in fact help people and eventually minimize risk. So I had a kind of an aim in mind that might be the case. And as with many mapping projects, things culminate or coalesce. You have to have reasons to make maps. Fast forward to 2011, this is about 20 years. I'm 20 years into a cartographic career as a GIS professor in the UK, and I totally left academia and moved to California to live and work for Esri. where I could make maps and I could write about them and teach people how to make them and basically have an academic career without having to grade student work, which I can guarantee is fun. And not long after I arrived, I saw this map rolled up in the corner of one of my co-workers' office, and I saw it and I thought, yeah, that was reignited my memory of the map, of the book that I'd read, Death in the Grand Canyon. But I was intrigued by the colours on this, and it was made by Scott Carter at USGS at the time, and it was made in 3D. It doesn't look it, but the colours that were used allow you to view the map in 3 dimensions wearing a pair of special glasses, which we'll come on to in a moment. And looking at the detail in here, it was a topographic map. The technique it used for encoding height, elevation, was called chromostereoscopy, and that built 3D viewing capabilities into the map image. And it looked a little bit weird, you know, really saturated reds and blues for the labels, for instance. But as part of my new job was to show people how to develop these kind of, you know, boundary pushing techniques, the idea was born. I was going to use this, marry this 3D technique with the information from the book, and create the map of deaths in the Grand Canyon with a 3D viewing capability. Well, where'd you get the data from? So I contacted Mike Giglieri, and he was very gracious. I sought permission to use his book as reference material, and he didn't have a map. He actually just had a spreadsheet of all sorts of bits of information that he had gleaned from park ranger reports and various newspaper reports over the years. And he'd done some remarkable, you know, background research to find all of these bits of information, but he didn't have precise coordinates or precise details. Nevertheless, he gave me permission. So I basically rifled through all of that data and created points as close as I could to a location where, you know, we thought that person had perished. So onto the 3D technique. Now, there's many ways to make a map look 3D. On the left, we've got the anaglyph approach, where you have 2 offset images and you wear a pair of glasses that filters blue and red light, and that has the effect of creating a 3-dimensional image in your field of view. The chromostereoscopic technique is kind of similar, but it just uses color. And instead of having blue and red sides to the glasses, the glasses themselves have minute little prisms. And what happens here is different wavelengths of light get refracted at different angles, and it actually has the end appearance of moving red to be closer to your field of vision and blue further away. Now, this is going to make a map look really kind of bizarre, right? Because the height is going to be bright red. If I was doing a volcano, such as this, it's going to look really weird. You know, we don't expect reds to be at higher elevations. But I actually figured the Grand Canyon's elevations are largely red. There's a lot of red rock, so I might be able to get away with this. Now, a better way of thinking of it is just think of Dark Side of the Moon. We were talking about younger generations of map makers earlier, and I guarantee you whenever I show this picture, they've never heard of the album, let alone the band. But I'm hoping that this might, at least some of you might have heard it. But this is the better way to think about how those prisms work, and it just refracts light in different ways, which means we see things at an apparent distance. But you do have to have the eyes and the glasses, and also in this occasion the hair. This picture was taken a few years ago, and I've since lost a bit more, and then finally took the decision to get rid of it altogether, which turns out to be very good, because you can't get a haircut in these times. So brilliant, what a great decision. Now, I'm sorry, you probably won't have these glasses today, so you're not going to be able to see this map in 3D. It doesn't matter. If you want to, they're about $2. And a company called American Paper Optics, who I do not have shares in, make these glasses, and you know, you can get them off Amazon or whatever. So if you want to look at anything in 3D that uses this technique, then by all means, go and buy a pair of these El Cheapo glasses. Now, this works for anything. You look at a bowl of fruit with a red apple and a green apple, and I can't think of a blue fruit, but one might exist. Your bowl of fruit will look 3-dimensional. So this isn't just this technique, this is for anything where color might be encoded. Election maps are kind of interesting, but perhaps we'll stay clear of that at the moment. So you build a color palette, and on the left here is basically a rainbow color palette. That's the purest form, I guess, of using this approach, the chromostereoscopic approach. I didn't want the map to be too shouty. I didn't want it to have these absolute pure colors. So I built an algorithmic, I can't even say it today, algorithmic color ramp in ArcGIS, which kind of went through the same color space, excuse me, but with slightly muted colors. Okay. Next, unlike the Washburns who spent years surveying, I just basically went to USGS website and downloaded a nice high-res DEM. So mapping's changed, right? Technology, and remember, it's always been an art, a science, and a technology. And at various points, those three have waxed and waned. Some have been more important or have shifted in leaps and bounds at different points in time. I think what we're seeing at the moment, just as a tangent, is technology leaping and making us leap through different hoops. So we start with the digital elevation model. We build a hillshade, nothing particularly wonderful, but I was just trying to get the map built. I create some hypsometric tints, some elevation tints using the chromostereoscopic color scheme that I built. Red for plateaus descending down through browns and greens to the river, which would eventually be blue. And you merge these two hillshades and hypsometric tints together with a pan sharpening technique, and you get this kind of thing. So this is the map's background, effectively. And on top of that, you develop some symbols. Now, in Giglieri's book, he categorized the symbols into, I think it's 8 or 9 different categories of depth. So it's classified information. And we developed these little pictograms. I used a sort of a warning sign or triangle to try to reference the danger involved, and clearly the symbol itself is trying to warn of a danger in that area. And I went through every incident, and there's over 450 incidents that locate over 770 deaths by 2012. I got an approximate position, as I mentioned, and I plotted them. And unfortunately, as it transpires, and really Matt mentioned this, actually most people go to a very small portion of Grand Canyon. And because of that, if you want to make a map of the whole Grand Canyon, but most of your thematic data is in one very small portion, you're going to need to, and it's a print product, this first and foremost, you're actually going to have an awful lot of leader lines, which makes the map look pretty ugly. I'll come to how I solve that or resolve it later on. But it was a difficult cartographic dilemma. Nevertheless, I ended up with this. You can see the inset there in the top left. Now, I filled the map with not just symbols, but quotes from the book, some of the ones that had stood out to me a little bit. And because I wanted to create additional depth when viewed in 3D, I went for this very saturated red annotation, boxes, I guess, and the border, and so on and so forth. Now, the fixed scale determines the amount of content on the map. You have to have an inset map. The south rim near the village is the place where most of these deaths occurred. And all these additions created a particular aesthetic. I was definitely going for a comic book aesthetic. And I'll come on in a moment, but I kind of regret that, but I'll tell you why in a moment. And then we printed it at about 20 feet wide, because it's the Grand Canyon, right? It's enormous. And so you only really get to see the richness of the layering and the detail in the DEM if you print it at a ridiculous size. Now, fortunately, we have such a printer at the company, and we're able to create these sort of maps on vinyl, and we sort of hang them around San Diego Convention Center most years, and fortunately this one made the cut, and there it is in sort of real life with Linda for scale down in the bottom. So feedback. Now, people generally loved it. They were moved to go up to the map and to look. They loved the drama, but the comic book aesthetic, not so much. It caused some complaints, and some felt that I'd been a little bit disrespectful on what is, after all, a very difficult and sometimes very personal subject matter to them, and I totally agree. And the border in particular caused the most comments because people thought it was supposed to be representing blood splatter. It wasn't. That was just a sort of a subconscious byproduct of my decision to go with the comic book aesthetic. I hadn't intended to say, yeah, let's just make this really macabre. But the point is, when we're making maps, sometimes we get so detached from the subject matter that we lose a little bit of perspective on, how this is going to be received. Well, it was kind of interesting because it won a major International Cartographic Association award, even though, remember, I'd stolen the technique from Scott Carter. It was nothing new. I just reinvented it using our software. And it made it into a book where it was actually commented on. This is in the Routledge Handbook of Mapping and Cartography by Alexander Kent. And he quoted, he said about the map, immersion into a sensory experience that is perhaps reminiscent of film director Quentin Tarantino's work, especially through its association with the visceral comic book aesthetic. And I probably would agree with him there, even though I hadn't necessarily thought of it as a Tarantino-esque approach, but it does show you that you can make maps that riff off all manner of different artistic styles, whether it's visual art or movies or literature or whatever it might be. It even made it onto Slovenian national TV science program for discussion, which is kind of interesting, and it's been downloaded an awful lot. Let's look at the web map version. Because of course the era of paper maps has changed. We get a lot of our maps through the web and through social media. The paper map is by no means dead, but delivering the map on the web offers new opportunities and different design approaches and so on. So it's a multi-scale environment. We have to design maps at many scales, excuse me, that not only work at an individual scale, but work at multiple scales throughout the stack. And it also allows you to be able to have pop-ups and rollovers and put the data into the map as well, so people can retrieve the information. So I needed a new technique. I was going to bin the data at smaller scales. The black dots here represent the individual deaths. The hexagons represent bins in which I'm going to position the information. And you could click on one of these hexagons and retrieve information about how many deaths of certain categories fall into that area. And I was also going to use chromostereoscopy here as a backdrop. I was going to use slightly differently styled symbols, hexagons instead of triangles, because they tessellate better. And I'd already decided to use a hex binning technique into which to classify my deaths. And this is the map. This is basically the scale at which the large map was made, but I had to make all these additional maps as well. And I'm not going to spend any time looking through this. It's really just to illustrate that the process of moving ahead with technological change in cartography demands a different approach if you're going to make your maps for web delivery. There's lots of different decisions to be made at each map scale, depending on content, how it's to be viewed, how it's to be rendered, how it's to be symbolized, and how it works with all of the different scales either side. So I ended up with this first iteration of the map, and it's kind of interesting now that this starts to look dated, right? Even in the last few years, our web maps have improved massively in terms of their visual appeal. But you can click on an area and get a really awful pie chart. Or you could zoom in and you could use a real real imagery now, not just a chromostereoscopic backdrop, but actual imagery of the real world with the pictogram symbols on top. And when you zoom in, you get to see these individual symbols, and you can click on each symbol and you can learn something about that particular person. And in a sense, this is a much more fuller representation of Giglieri's book than the print map could ever achieve. And of course, there's no inset either. You just keep zooming in, which is an interesting aspect of web map delivery. But I've since updated it. I mean, sadly, human tragedy didn't stop in 2012. That map wasn't it. The publication of Giglieri and Meyer's book, or My Map, didn't stop the numbers increasing. And of course, one of the problems of making such a thematic map like this is it really just captures a point in time. And if you need to update the map, you have to get the data somehow. But of course, you need impetus. It wasn't my job. It didn't become my job to create this map every year or have a live feed every time there was a new piece of data to add to it. It was just an attempt to use a different technique at that point. So the impetus for the map was about to get real in about a year and a half, 2 years ago. So Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Will Smith turned 50. Late 2018, and he decided to celebrate his birthday by bungee jumping into the Grand Canyon from a helicopter. I turned 50 around about the same time. I went out for a nice meal. I think I'm not going to do what he did. Anyway, the production company behind that map that I'd made had seen it, and they decided they want to use it as part of the coverage that they were going to do a live broadcast of Will Smith jumping into the canyon. Now, I was kind of concerned. The possibility of having to add Will Smith to the map if things didn't go very well was worrying me a little bit. But there again, when you're asked if you want one of your maps to co-star alongside Will Smith, you say yes, which is what I did. So I went about trying to find some new data. I went back to Giglieri. He hadn't got the data. I contacted Brandon Torres, who works in search and rescue for the National Park Service, and he was extremely helpful and sent me an Excel file with details of the deaths between 2011 to just about the end of 2018. It was just about as up to date as I could do. So I got to work redoing the map. And one of the major updates I wanted to do was with the quality of the background. Remember, I've got it in my mind, this love for the Washburn map, the National Geographic map. This has always been biting at me. Can I make a map using automated techniques that gets anywhere near to what they achieved with that product in 1978? We're several decades later. If we can't improve things, what are we doing? That's my take on it. We have to be able to at least match the quality of those maps, if not try to improve on it. And this is the hillshade at that time. When I made it in 2012 for the first map, it's quite blurry. There's not a lot of definition. The light source is predominantly from the top left at an angle of 135 degrees and 45 degrees zenith. This is typical. But when does that ever happen? And when does it ever happen in a place as crazy as Grand Canyon, with light knocking about off different faces in all sorts of amazing ways and creating local illumination? So I always look at old manual techniques for inspiration. In this case, I wanted to try to get a hillshade closer to what Tibor Toth was able to create. And using not new techniques, but using a range of other techniques, I built this, which reveals the layering, I think, in a little bit more clearly, and which also perhaps creates something that captures more of the ethereal quality of Grand Canyon. Incorporates a lot of shadows, it gives depths, and there's basically about 60 different hillshades here that have been combined. And then if you combine that with a slightly more saturated set of hypsometric tints than I used on the first map, you get something that I think is quite unique. Remember, Toth and the other cartographers on the project made their map very saturated, but it was browns and greens. I've made this very saturated, but it's just a different use of color to achieve the same techniques. And so there's been around 100 additional deathly incidents since the first map, taking the total to about 950. There's less red, It's less dramatic. Here's the new map. It's perhaps more respectful. I've got rid of the comic book aesthetic. It's more vibrant range of colors in the focused area. I haven't made the entire map chromostereoscopic, but I've kind of called it out as a sort of with a border around the canyon itself to highlight that it is, you know, this huge scar across the landscape. I found a way of getting the map's scale and symbol size to balance, so I didn't need leader lines. I wanted to improve that and get away from that. I also decided not to encode elevation into the symbols. Those triangles on the previous map did have elevation, chromostereoscopic elevation encoded into them. It didn't really work that well. And, you know, there's a tip for any budding cartographer. If something doesn't work, change it. You know, be prepared to modify even your own ideas. There's still an inset over on the far right, if it's not hidden by people on a Zoom meeting, but there's an inset over there that does look at the South Rim in more detail. And I kind of downplayed the 3D characteristic and ditched it from the title even. If you have the glasses, it works wonderfully, but you can read the map without the glasses, and I still think it is just a dramatic way of capturing the information. So the map becomes more harmonious, less shouty perhaps, and the web map version has received many of the same updates, though I've been able to work with the symbols so that they actually turn into single incident symbols a long time before you get to just one layer where they all appear, and that helps with people to identify individual events as opposed to areas where there's been multiple events. Technically, the map was rebuilt, completely constructed in a different way to the one made in 2012, which had an awful lot of hacks to make it work. A lot of things going on behind the scenes, and John was right. A lot of, you know, calls to developers. You know, how can I get this to work? You can't. Yeah, but I want to. Yeah, you can't. But I'm going to. All right, let's find a way. And those kind of, you know, conversations, and then eventually 4 years later, you find that the technology has started to incorporate a lot of those demands that not just I, but a lot of web mappers were wanting to see achieve. And that's a whole other different story. So I think possibly the best improvement is also the user interface. This looks like a modern web map now, certainly if we compare it to the one I showed you a moment ago. It's a lot less cluttered, it's more functional, it's classier even. And the interesting thing as well is the first map I entered for a British Cartographic Society award in, I think it was 2013, and basically it didn't come anywhere. Rubbish. They didn't say rubbish, but they just said it's not particularly impressive. The hillshade's not great. The leader lines are ugly, not so good. And then I submitted this map to the same awards, maybe 5 or 6 years later, and they were ecstatic over it and gave it best in show kind of thing. So it's kind of interesting how the same map, just with a totally updated or different aesthetic, can actually lead the same set of judges to a completely different discussion as well. Have I got anywhere near Tibor Toth's rendering from that map from 1978? I don't know, possibly not. That's for others to judge, really. But to me, it's a heck of a fun job trying to get there, trying to achieve something close to what those geniuses were able to build. But what can I say? This map was done from the comfort of my office, and digital data has meant that I can experiment with designs and publish them with updates as frequently or as not as I want, and I can leave stuff on the cutting room floor if I want. So just to sort of end up with a couple of final slides, that Grand Canyon map in National Geographic's 1978 issue, it inspired me when I was a kid, was the result of years of hard toil and manual cartography. And the work of cartography, the cartographer's changed beyond recognition. I'm able to do these things now from my office with new technologies. But it's still a wonderful job to be able to make maps to tell these stories. And finally, that map was totally inspired by a book that I read, that we read in our tent. And for the last few years, or up until, I guess, middle of 2018, I'd been busy writing a book on cartography to kind of just give back to the subject everything I'd learned from people that have tutored me or given me experience or helped me along the way, or map societies that I've been involved with where I've met some wonderful people who I've learned a lot from. And I was able to feature my map of the Grand Canyon in the book. And I chose a page on pictograms to talk about symbol design to do it. But it's not just a book about my work in cartography. I was also able to completely, close the circle and include what I consider to be still the map of Grand Canyon, with a wonderful commentary by the current director of cartography at National Geographic, Martin Gamache, who describes it wonderfully. And he's one of the quotes that he put into the book was, "The work that went into this map set the bar for what cartographic excellence was. It still does." And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. So whatever happened to my map being used in the Will Smith bungee jump film? Because I know that's the critical question that's that you all want the answer to. Well, guess what? It didn't. It ended up on the cutting room floor. They ran rings around me all the way up until the day before, saying, "We're going to include it. We're going to include it. We're going to include it." And then I got an email saying, "Oh, the show's just too long. We're not going to include it." Now, I watched the show. It was rubbish. It was just full of people chatting about, "Oh, Will's such a great guy." Well, not really. He didn't want my map. So that's it. I'm never working with Will Smith in the end. And that's probably the crucial takeaway from this entire talk. If Will Smith ever asks you to work with him, perhaps don't. So final thing, if you can see me anywhere, I don't know whether you can, or it's just my screen. Of course, I do have the map. And, it's one of my prized possessions. I actually haven't got it framed yet, but I still have the map. And that's kind of the end of the little talk. If you want to go and have a look at the web map, there's a very simple URL, or the print map you can download and print if you wish, and please do.
Well, Ken,
I think with that I'll stop sharing, and then we can perhaps get into some discussions.
that's great, Ken. There are first of all, I see all sorts of applauses on the gallery view. There were 2 questions in the chat that are about the underlying data. Did you, other than the more frequently trafficked points, were there patterns in the data? And then did you see any seasonality to it?
Oh, seasonality is a great question. And the answer is I haven't looked at it, so I can't tell you. I mean, there are clusters, but it's as you might imagine. I mean, a lot of maps, when you're working with thematic data, they end up just reinforcing your impression of what you think it's going to be. So, of course, most of the accidents are very near trails, and it's often people that have perhaps accidentally veered off a trail and not been able to find their way back to it, and then have fallen, or perhaps died from exhaustion, heat stroke, dehydration, or something. Typically, and sadly, the suicides tend to be from very similar places, and they're largely. It seems like people don't go out of the way to travel very far. They'll just get to the nearest place where they can park a car, and unfortunately, that tends to be a pattern in that type of death. The major rapids, as you might imagine, are going to take the victims of drownings most commonly. There's some random ones where it's maybe a snake bite, and it's just in the middle of nowhere, and then somebody's accidentally come across a rattlesnake and been bitten, and then can't get out of the canyon. But yeah, mostly around places that you would typically imagine people to be, and that's where they're going to perish. But mostly around the South Rim, because that's where most people go.
Yeah, about like 90%, according to what Matt said. We have a question here, or does someone want to unmute themselves to ask a question? Otherwise,
yeah. So I'm curious. I have a background in graphic design, so I've made posters that have been public before and have kind of seen people's reaction. I'm just wondering, like, was this the map you got the most reaction to, and how did it affect you emotionally?
It's not the map that's got the most reaction, but I do like playing with that perceptual and cognitive side to how people react to maps. I always try to make a map that people are going to want to look at, because otherwise there's no point in it. So I quite often use techniques that they might not even be aware of that I'm using. Like, I'm going to use bright red because you're going to look at it and you're going to, just because you want to know what a map is doing with bright red on it. But I guess the one map that I really did play to people's emotions was a map I made in 2009 on Irish surnames. And so what I wanted to do was, and this is before I worked at Esri, I used to go to the user conference and put maps in the map gallery. And I made a map that was basically emerald green of Ireland. And across the map, it was a dreadful data set, awful data. But I made a way to put in a Gaelic typeface surnames of births, or put it the other way, the surnames of babies that had been born in like an 1895 census or something. And the Gaelic typeface all over the map, labels and names, bright green everywhere, some sort of Celtic border. And it was on one way a dreadful map, but on the other way, what I wanted to do was hang it in the user conference gallery and see what people's reactions were. And I'm going to be totally honest here. The year before, Linda and I had been to the user conference, and the map that won the user conference Best in Show award, we thought was absolute rubbish. Just a point of view. And we were walking out of that last sort of session and chuntering about this. And I just turned to her and said, how do we force a win at this conference?
Those are a map troll.
And it was her idea. She said, well, how do you get a lot of Americans to look at a map? Okay, let's play to, that idea of putting your finger on the map and saying you are here, or wanting to find something out about history of where you've come from. And, the States is a land of immigrants. And, I found a lot of people come up to me and say, we've got Irish ancestry. I thought, okay. So that was the point of the map. It's like, how can we get people interested in the map? Well, you make a map that's designed just for that purpose. I have no interest in genealogy or anything like that. It was just purely a map. And it was a fascinating week. We went through the map gallery several times, and there were always huddles of people, and they were touching the map. They were actually physically touching the map. That's my surname. Maybe that's where I'm from. Or they knew that their name had a particular link to a particular county, and they found it. And guess what? The map won. So that's how you can, bend, I guess, visual design, graphic design in a cartographic sense to force people to form a view of a particular way. Sorry, it was a really long answer.
No.
That's a great answer.
That's great. That's great. One more thing came into the chat. I think that's a request for some technical help on some kidney disease mapping. I can only imagine the symbols on that one.
Okay. Certainly, they can send me an email if they
Sure.
really want. It's just kfield@esri.com. Send me an email. I can help.
Yeah, and we're scheduled here for a 10-minute break before we start our business meeting. I hope everyone or a lot of people hang out for the business meeting. We'll hear a bit about the health of society. We'll get some reports and have a moment for one of our founding fathers who passed away this year. Norman Thrower passed just about 2 months ago, I think it was. Again, thanks, Ken, and everybody else who participated today. Ken, I don't think you're getting overtime from Esri for working on a Saturday morning.
Oh, I'm charging this. Don't worry about that.
All right, good.
Which means I'll buy you all a beer when we can meet in person. But thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I do hope to see you face to face next July in San Diego.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, thank you.